They captured him alive, not in the sky, not over enemy lines, but on their own airfield, surrounded by German soldiers, with a pistol already drawn and no escape left to calculate. His aircraft was burning behind him. Oil smoke rolled across the frozen ground. The engine was dead. His leg was injured. The math of survival was simple and brutal. This was the end. The German officer looked down at the American pilot and saw exactly what he expected to see. A defeated man, a broken machine, a victory measured in seconds. Then the pilot started laughing, not shouting, not begging, not praying. Laughing. It wasn't hysteria. And it wasn't madness. It was timing. Because while the Germans focused on the wreckage, the prisoner, and the moment they believed they controlled, something else was already moving. High above the airfield, unseen and unaccounted for, an American fighter was circling, not attacking, not leaving, watching. 41 seconds later, the sound reached the ground. Engines, fast low, too many to count. The officer's grip loosened. The pistol dropped. Men who had been shouting moments earlier stopped where they stood, frozen between command and instinct. Then the first guns opened up. When the firing stopped, the airfield was silent. But because everything that mattered on that field had been destroyed, the pilot survived. He was taken prisoner. He would spend the rest of the war behind wire, but in those 41 seconds between capture and silence, the situation reversed completely. The Germans had won a pilot and lost an airfield. It is not a story about luck, and it is not a story about bravery under fire. It is a story about a moment when one side believed the fight was over, and the other understood it had just begun. If you want to understand how moments like this actually shaped the air war, stay with this story. In the winter of 1944, being captured as a fighter pilot behind enemy lines was not a dramatic turning point. It was a conclusion by that stage of the war. There were no illusions left about rescue, mercy, or escape. A downed pilot on German-controlled ground faced a narrow set of outcomes, none of them favorable. Transport prison camps, whose conditions deteriorated with each passing month as the Reich collapsed inward under relentless pressure. The moment the aircraft stopped moving, the pilot's war was effectively finished. That was the assumption held by everyone involved. The German ground crews, the officer shearing the crash site. Fighter pilots understood this arithmetic better than anyone. Low-altitude attacks had become routine by late 1944, but they came with unforgiving risks. Engines failed. Flak struck without warning. A single hit below 1,000 feet could mean landing in territory where the front lines were no longer clear, where rescue was unlikely, and where capture often came within minutes. Once on the ground, there were no second chances. The Germans knew this. Their airfield defenses were designed not only to destroy aircraft, but to trap pilots in exactly this situation. Light anti-aircraft guns ringed runways and dispersal areas. Infantry units were positioned to converge quickly on crash sites. The objective was simple: remove pilots from the air war as efficiently as possible. From the German perspective, this moment represented control. The chaos of attack had passed. The threat in the air was retreating. What remained was cleanup, wreckage, fires, prisoners. The American pilot on the ground fit neatly into that picture: injured, unarmed, surrounded, his aircraft destroyed. By late 1944, the air war over Western Europe had reached a phase where assumptions were increasingly dangerous. The Allied fighter forces had evolved beyond escort and defense. They were no longer reacting to German actions. They were hunting systems, airfields, logistics, fuel, anything that allowed the Luftwaffe to continue operating, even at diminished strength. Every aircraft that landed, every engine that started, every runway that remained usable was part of a network under constant pressure. And pressure had changed doctrine. American fighter pilots were no longer instructed to disengage once a mission was complete. They were encouraged to exploit opportunities. Air superiority was no longer measured solely by victories in the air, but by the enemy's inability to operate at all. This shift created a dangerous overlap between moments of apparent safety and moments of extreme vulnerability. An airfield that had just repelled an attack was not secure. It was exposed. Its crews were focused on damage control. Its command structure was momentarily fragmented. In theory, the threat had passed. In reality, it had only changed shape for the Germans on the ground. Capturing a pilot reinforced a belief that the immediate danger was over. The aircraft was destroyed, the attacker neutralized. But air warfare no longer obeyed that rhythm. The American pilot on the ground did not possess any special authority, weapon, or means of escape. He could not signal. He could not communicate. He could not influence events through action. What he had was understanding of how American fighter units operated in this phase of the war. Understanding of how quickly radio calls traveled between flights. Understanding of how doctrine treated downed pilots not as isolated losses, but as coordinates. A crash site was no longer just an accident. It was information. And information moved faster than any individual aircraft. A captured pilot fit neatly into a familiar script. The danger had been contained, the threat neutralized, control restored. But war rarely punishes action. It punishes assumptions. What neither side could yet fully see was that the capture itself had created a new problem, one that did not exist, a reason to return, a justification for concentration of force. The pilot on the ground understood that the most dangerous moment was not when he crashed. It was the moment the Germans believed they had won, because victory in air war was never measured by what lay burning on the ground. It was measured by what could still fly. And in the seconds after his capture, the balance of that equation was already shifting. By late 1944, the air war over Western Europe had stopped being about survival and started becoming about exhaustion. For the Luftwaffe, the problem was no longer courage or skill. German pilots were still capable, still dangerous in individual engagements. What they lacked was time, fuel, aircraft, and the ability to recover from loss. Every mission flown by the Allies forced the same calculation on German commanders. Which units could be spared, which airfields could still operate, which resources could no longer be replaced. The Allied air forces understood this shift clearly. The strategic bombing campaign had already crippled oil production and transportation networks. Heavy bombers struck industrial targets daily, but bombers alone could not finish the job. What remained functional had to be hunted down closer to the ground where it was most vulnerable and hardest to protect. That task fell increasingly to fighter aircraft. Early in the war, fighters existed to shield bombers. Their job was to stay close, repel attackers, and avoid unnecessary risk. Losses were acceptable only when they preserved the bomber formations. Aggression beyond that rule was discouraged. By the end of 1944, that doctrine was obsolete. Fighter command and kern for home. Fighters were authorized to remain forward, to seek out airfields, to attack parked aircraft, to destroy fuel stores, maintenance facilities, and anti-aircraft positions. The goal was not just to win battles in the air, but to ensure the Luftwaffe could not rise to fight the next day. This change reshaped the battlefield. German airfields became targets not at predictable times. A field that launched interceptors in the morning could be under attack by afternoon. Another might be struck without ever having launched a single aircraft, simply because it was visible, active, and within range of fighters. Returning with ammunition to spare, the air war became relentless. For fighter pilots, this meant operating at lower altitudes, where speed and altitude advantage disappeared. It meant exposing aircraft to light flak, small arms fire, and concentrated ground defenses. These were not duels between pilots. They were calculated risks taken against guns. Losses increased accordingly. Statistics from late 1944 showed that ground attack missions cost fighter groups aircraft at rates approaching those suffered by bomber crews earlier in the war. Engines failed from damage. Pilots were hit by fragments they never saw. Airfield went down far from friendly lines, often in areas with no clear front. A forced landing at altitude might offer a chance. A forced landing near an enemy airfield offered none. German defenses were built around this reality. Airfields were protected by layered anti-aircraft fire. Light flak was positioned to cover approach paths. Heavier guns defended dispersal areas and fuel dumps. Infantry units were assigned to secure crash sites quickly, denying pilots any opportunity to evade. The objective was not mercy, it was efficiency. A pilot captured was one less pilot flying tomorrow, but this defensive system had its own weakness. Airfields under attack rarely operated as cohesive units. Some crews focused on aircraft already damaged. Others rushed to protect fuel or ammunition. Gun crews tracked targets in different sectors, reacting to what they could see rather than what might come next. Nations suffered under pressure. American pilots, flying repeated missions over the same regions, noticed this. They began to recognize patterns. Gun positions that shifted after initial attacks. Dispersal layouts that revealed where valuable assets were hidden. Each attack produced information. This intelligence did not always reach formal reports. Much of it lived in the memories of pilots, in informal discussions, in quick sketches drawn on maps during downtime. A crash site became part of that information network. When a pilot went down, standard procedure called for marking the location and reporting it. Rescue was rare behind enemy lines, but intelligence value remained high. A downed aircraft revealed where defenses were concentrated, how quickly ground units responded to attacks. By late 1944, some pilots had begun to think differently about these moments. A crash did not necessarily end the mission, it transformed it. Radio communication allowed information to move faster than aircraft themselves. A circling fighter could relay a position to other flights still airborne. Those flights did not require lengthy briefings, they only need coordinates and confirmation. The air war rewarded speed. German commanders understood the danger in theory, but the tempo of Allied operations made it difficult to counter. Aircraft were dispersed to reduce losses on the ground. Defenses were reinforced, but reinforcement drew resources away from other sectors. Every adjustment created new vulnerabilities. No airfield was ever fully secure. What made this environment particularly dangerous was timing the moment immediately after an attack. Appeared on the surface to be a moment of relief. The sky cleared, engines faded into the distance. That moment invited complacency. In reality, it was often the most exposed phase. Of all defenses were misaligned. Crews were scattered. Command decisions lagged behind. Events, if a second strike came quickly enough, it encountered an airfield in the middle of recovery, rather than prepared for defense. The Americans did not always exploit it. Coordination was imperfect. Weather interfered. Radio calls went unanswered. But the pilots who understood it carried that knowledge with them into every mission. A downed pilot, watched by enemy soldiers, could not change his fate through action, but he could still understand the system unfolding around him. He could see whether aircraft were circling. He could estimate response times. He could calculate whether what had just happened was an ending or an opening. For the Germans on the ground, the pilot in their custody represented closure. For the Americans in the air, he represented a point on the map. The difference between those perspectives was measured in seconds. By the time winter settled fully over Western Europe, freezing airfields and slowing ground movement, the air war had become a contest not just of firepower but of perception, of knowing when a moment had truly passed and when it had merely shifted form. The capture of a pilot was supposed to end a story in this environment. It often did the opposite. The mission that morning did not begin with urgency. It rarely did. Briefings in late 1944 followed a familiar rhythm. Weather first, target second. Expected opposition delivered with the same restrained language that masked how little certainty actually existed. Crews listened, nodded, memorized call signs and altitudes, then walked out into cold air that burned exposed skin within seconds. Frost-coated wings. Engine protested as they turned over. Ground crews worked quickly, knowing that lingering meant numb hands and mistakes. The bomber stream lifted off before dawn, heavy aircraft climbing slowly through layered cloud. Fighter escorts formed up as they always did, sliding into position above and beside the bombers, watching contrails stretch across the sky like chalk lines that pointed unavoidably toward enemy territory. For the first hours, nothing unusual happened. Enemy fighter then committing flak bursts dotted the distance. Radio chatter stayed. Controlled, the mission progressed according to expectations, which in itself was a warning sign. It was after the bombers released their loads and turned west that the situation changed. Returning flights reported activity on the ground, airfields worked in dispersal areas, vehicles moving, signs of operational readiness that intelligence had marked as targets of opportunity. This was the phase of the mission where decisions carried disproportionate weight. Fighter leaders had discretion home with full ammunition, or they could press their luck descending into areas where altitude advantage vanished. On this day, the decision was made quickly. A Luftwaffe airfield lay within reach, identified by reconnaissance as active and lightly defended. The weather was marginal but flyable. Ammunition loads were intact, the opportunity was clear. The flight descended through broken cloud ends. The round rushed up to meet them. Snow-dusted fields and dark forest patches lit beneath the wings. Navigation tightened. Every landmark mattered. When the airfield came into view, it appeared almost calm. A grass strip bordered by trees, dispersal revetments partially hidden under camouflage, several aircraft visible on the ground, movement near hangarable. The attack began with speed and violence. The lead aircraft went in, low guns firing, chasers walking across a parked fighter that erupted into flame. A second pass destroyed a fuel vehicle, the explosion throwing debris into the air and sending ground crews scattering. Anti-aircraft fire responded immediately, like flak stitching the sky with rapid bursts. For the pilots, time compressed. Each second required decisions measured in fractions. Adjust aim, watch altitude, track chasers, avoid collision, pull up before the ground rose too fast. It was during this phase that the defenses revealed their true strength. The Germans had reinforced the field since the last report. Additional guns opened fire. Shrapnel tore through the air in unpredictable patterns. One aircraft shuddered violently. Warning lights illuminated in the cockpit. Instruments flickered. Oil pressure dropped sharply. The pilot knew the meaning instantly. An engine losing oil at low output would fail. But where? Continuing the attack meant certain loss over the field. Breaking away offered a slim chance of reaching friendly territory, but the distance was unforgiving and the engine's condition deteriorated by the second. The calculation was quick and merciless. The aircraft pulled up and away, climbing shallowly in a desperate attempt to gain altitude before power vanished entirely. The engine ran rough, then seized with the grinding finality that transmitted through the airframe like a physical blow. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Smoke streamed from the cowling. The aircraft was now a glider. Below, the airfield burned fires marked where earlier passes had struck. Anti-aircraft guns continued firing at retreating fighters, their crews focused outward, unaware that one damaged aircraft was descending directly toward them. There were no good options left. The pilots selected the only stretch of ground within reach that offered a chance of survival. Altitude bled away faster than expected. Trees rose. A fence flashed past. Then the ground came up hard. The impact was violent. The aircraft struck belly first, sliding across frozen earth, shedding pieces of itself as it went. Metal screamed. Dirt and debris filled the cockpit. The air spun. For a moment the pilot did not move. Pain registered slowly. His head rang. His leg burned with a sharp intensity that suggested injury. Smoke seeped into the cockpit, acrid and choking. He forced himself to act before fire or explosion, finish what gravity had started. By the time he cleared the wreckage, German soldiers were already running toward him. They arrived quickly, weapons raised, shouting orders he could not understand. He raised his hands, a universal signal. There was no weapon to reach for, no direction to run. His leg would not support him even if there had been. The soldiers pulled him from the wreckage with rough efficiency, dragging him clear of the aircraft. He stumbled and fell onto the frozen ground, breath knocked from his lungs. An officer arrived moments later, pistol drawn, uniform immaculate despite the chaos around them. He looked down at the pilot, not with rage but with assessment. The American was injured, unarmed, captured the airfield, though damaged, was under control. From the German perspective, the sequence had resolved itself cleanly. The attack had been repelled, a pilot had been removed from the war, the immediate threat had passed. The officer issued orders, the soldiers relaxed slightly, the pilot remained on the ground, hands raised, breathing heavily, aware that his role in the battle had ended. Or so it appeared. What neither side yet acknowledged was that the most important phase of the engagement had not occurred during the strafing run or the crash. It was unfolding now in the seconds after capture, when assumptions hardened and defenses shifted away from the sky above the airfield. Beyond the sightlines of those on the ground, something else was happening. A fighter aircraft was circling, and that changed everything. The aircraft circling above the airfield was not an accident. In the closing months of 1944, fighters did not loiter without purpose. Fuel was precious. Ammunition was meant to be spent. Time in hostile airspace was measured carefully. If a pilot remained overhead, it was because he was doing something specific, marking a location, or calling for help. From the ground, the circling fighter was difficult to see. Low winter cloud flattened the sky. Mutant contrast. Smoke from burning aircraft drifted across the field, breaking sight lines and distracting attention. To the Germans below, the airspace appeared momentarily empty, cleared by the retreating attack. The pilot on the ground did not share that belief. He could not see the radio, he could not hear the transmission, but he understood the process. A single aircraft overhead meant coordinates were already being relayed, not formally, not through command channels, but directly pilot to pilot, using short calls that cut through congestion. Location. Defenses damaged but active. Tides visible. In December 1944, there was enough. American fighter doctrine no longer required elaborate coordination. Pilots returning from escort duty often carried full ammunition loads. They were already airborne. All they needed was justification. On the ground, German soldiers continued their work. Wounded men were helped away from the wreckage. Fires were being assessed. Gun crews adjusted positions, some turning their weapons toward where the attacking aircraft had disappeared. Moments earlier, their defenses were oriented backward, was focused on the prisoner. The situation appeared stable. Control had been reestablished. The enemy aircraft were gone. The field had survived the attack. The pilot looked around, taking in details the others ignored. Which guns were still tracking the sky, which were idle, which areas were crowded with personnel, which assets were exposed. From initial radio contact to arrival at attack speed, the window was short. American fighters did not approach cautiously. They came in fast and low, minimizing warning and maximizing surprise. 40 seconds was generous. He began to laugh. It was not defiance, it was recognition. The German officer noticed immediately. The sound did not fit the situation. Prisoners did not laugh. Wounded men did not laugh. Captured pilots did not laugh on enemy airfields surrounded by armed soldiers. The officer's expression shifted. Confusion replaced confidence. Scanning the sky, the perimeter, the field itself for a moment, nothing happened. Then the sound arrived. Engines. Approaching fast, not retreating, not climbing, descending. The officer turned toward the noise just as the first aircraft broke through the cloud at treetop height. There was no warning fire, no ranging shots. The attack began immediately, guns already firing as the fighters crossed the perimeter. The second wave followed seconds later, splitting their approach. One element targeted dispersal areas where aircraft sat exposed. Another swept toward fuel and ammunition points already marked by smoke and activity. The airfield erupted, gunfire, explosions, and engine noise overlapped into a single overwhelming assault. The frozen ground shook with concussive force as fuel ignited and ammunition cooked off. Aircraft on the ground burned where they sat, some destroyed before their crews could even reach them. The pilot pressed himself flat against the ground. He covered his head, reducing his profile, letting the chaos wash over him. Chasers snapped overhead. Debris rained down. Heat from nearby fires pulsed against his exposed skin. The officer who had stood over him was gone. Whether he had run, taken cover, or been killed was impossible to know. The soldiers who had moments earlier controlled the field scattered in every direction, seeking shelter where none had been prepared. For 41 seconds, the airfield ceased to function as an organized space. There were no commands, no coordination, no defense, only reaction from the air. The attack unfolded according to patterns familiar to the pilot on the ground. He recognized the tsunami even as explosions tore the field apart, lead elements suppressing defenses, follow-on aircraft striking high-value targets, fighters breaking away at the last second, pulling up hard to avoid ground fire that no longer tracked effectively. The timing was not perfect. The defenses had already been degraded. The surprise was complete. The concentration of force was sufficient. The result was inevitable. When the last aircraft pulled away and the engine noise began to fade, the field was transformed. Smoke hung low over the runway, burning wreckage marked where operational aircraft had once stood. Vehicles smoldered. Gun positions were silent, their crews gone or incapacitated. The airfield was silent, not in peace, but in paralysis. The pilot remained on the ground long after the sound faded, waiting for the chaos to settle. When German soldiers began to emerge, cautiously from cover, their attention was no longer on him. Organization had collapsed. He was still a prisoner. He would remain one, but the moment that had defined his fate had already passed in 41 seconds. The balance of loss and damage had reversed completely. His capture had triggered more destruction than his original attack ever could have achieved. The Germans had gained a pilot, and neither side would forget the lesson. Silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, filling the gaps left behind when engines faded and gunfire stopped. Smoke drifted across the field, carried by a weak winter wind that scattered ash and the smell of burned fuel. Fires continued to burn, but without urgency. There were no aircraft left to scramble. No coordinated defense left to mount. The airfield had survived attacks before. This one was different. German personnel emerged cautiously from cover, some moving in small groups, others alone stepping around wreckage that had not existed minutes earlier. Men looked upward instinctively, expecting another wave, flinching at distant sounds that turned out to be nothing more than settling debris or collapsing structures. The rhythm of operations was gone. Gun crews inspected weapons that would not fire again that day. Vehicles sat disabled where they had been hit, blocking movement across the field. Aircraft that might have been salvaged earlier now burned unchecked, their frames twisting as heat consumed what remained. Commanders attempted to restore order. Orders were shouted, runners sent, ads assessments begun, but coordination was fragmented. Communicating had been interrupted. Personnel were missing. No one paid him much attention now. He was still injured, still unarmed, still surrounded by enemies. But in the aftermath of the attack, he had become irrelevant. A prisoner mattered far less than a destroyed airfield. Eventually, another officer approached him, older, slower, less hurried than the first. His uniform bore signs of wear that suggested months, perhaps years, of accumulated strain. He looked at the American not with anger but with something closer to weary appraisal. The pilot was helped to his feet and searched more thoroughly this time. His injury was obvious, his condition stable enough to move. Guards escorted him away from the open field toward a building that had escaped the worst of the damage. As they walked, he counted what he could. Burning aircraft, collapsed revetments, disabled vehicles, silenced guns. This was not a temporary disruption. The airfield would not launch fighters again anytime soon. Even if aircraft could be brought in from elsewhere, operating them from this field would be risky and inefficient. In air war terms, the field was neutralized. The immediate losses were measurable. Aircraft destroyed on the ground, equipment rendered unusable, personnel casualties that could not be quickly replaced. But the deeper damage ran beyond. Remove one and pressure shifted elsewhere. Surviving aircraft would be dispersed to alternate fields, some improvised and ill-equipped for sustained operations. Defensive resources would be relocated, weakening coverage in other sectors. Maintenance gates would decline. None of this was decisive on its own. They were won by accumulation. Each neutralized field reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to respond to the next mission. Each forced relocation increased wear on aircraft and crews. Each delay compounded shortages that already defined German operations. By late 1944, The pilot's capture became a footnote. His aircraft written off, his mission logged as incomplete, the airfield attack recorded as a success, with damage assessments updated as intelligence filtered in over the following days. Official records captured outcomes. They did not capture causally convey was the sequence that had unfolded. How a crash that should have removed one pilot from the war had instead triggered a chain reaction. How a moment of assumed control had created vulnerability. How timing rather than fibre alone had determined the result. For the pilot, captivity began quietly. He would be transported away from the airfield once order was restored. Sent to a camp where days blurred together under rationed food, cold barracks, and uncertainty. His role in the air war was finished. But the war itself moved on, shaped in small ways by what had happened here. The Luftwaffe unit assigned to the field never fully recovered. Records captured later showed declining readiness. Pilots were reassigned or consolidated with other units, diluting experience and cohesion. The airfield itself faded from use. By the time the front lines shifted and the war ended, its runways were no longer operational. Fitzillis dismantled or abandoned. The land eventually returned to agriculture. The scars of combat softened by time and plowing. Nothing about the place suggested its moment of significance. And yet, in the calculus of the air war, this was exactly how victory accumulated. Not in singular dramatic triumphs, but in moments where loss was multiplied by response, where an apparent defeat created opportunity, where silence followed not because fighting had ended. The pilot had not escaped. He had not survived by force of arms. He had not altered the war alone. But in the seconds after his capture, he had understood something essential, that the most dangerous assumption in war was believing the moment had passed, because sometimes the silence that follows is not the end of the story. It is the result. The destruction of an airfield was never measured only by what burned. What mattered most was what stopped happening afterward. Flights that did not launch, missions that were delayed or canceled, pilots who waited on the ground for aircraft that never arrived. In late 1944, the Luftwaffe no longer had the depth to absorb interruptions. Earlier in the war, a damaged field might be repaired, reinforced, and returned to service within days. Aircraft could be reassigned, fuel could be rerouted, losses could be offset by production. That margin was gone. By the time winter set in, German air operations were already operating at the edge of feasibility. Maintenance crews worked with limited parts. Aircraft were flown longer between inspections. Pilots were assigned to unfamiliar machines and bases. With little preparation, every disruption magnified strain elsewhere. When an airfield was neutralized, its aircraft did not simply disappear. They were pushed outward, redistributed. Logistics were improvised. Survivability dropped. Aircraft that might have survived multiple missions from a well-defended base were now exposed during takeoff and landing. Ground crews worked without proper cover. Fuel delivery traveled longer, more vulnerable. Each adjustment cost of attrition. The American Air Forces understood this dynamic intuitively. Even when they could not quantify it precisely, they did not need every attack to succeed perfectly. They only needed enough of them to force constant adaptation on an enemy who could no longer adapt indefinitely. The airfield attack triggered by the downed pilot. It removed a node from the network. It forced redistribution. It consumed resources. The Germans could not replace. The impact rippled outward. Other units absorbed aircraft and personnel, adjusted schedules to compensate for gaps in coverage. Pilots flew longer, sorties from farther bases, increasing fatigue and mechanical wear. None of this appeared dramatic in isolation, but war at this stage was no longer about dramatic victories. It was about cumulative pressure, about ensuring that when the next mission arrived, the response would be slower, weaker, or absent altogether. The Americans did not need to win the air war in a single day. They only needed to make tomorrow harder than today. The role of the downed pilot in this system was indirect, but crucial. His crash site became a data point. His capture fixed attention. His presence on the field delayed recovery and distorted priorities. German personnel focused on securing him, assessing the immediate situation. In doing so, they misjudged the timing window. Defenses realigned too late. Assets remained exposed too long. The second attack exploited that gap. Afterward, German analysis focused on damage, on what had been hit, on what had failed. But the deeper question was harder to answer. Why had the field been vulnerable at that exact moment? The answer lay not in equipment or manpower, but in assumption. The assumption that an attack once repelled was over. The assumption that capture equaled control. The assumption that the sky, briefly empty, would remain so. The American fighter doctrine was built to punish exactly that belief. By encouraging pilots to act opportunistically, to share information rapidly, and to exploit fleeting windows, the Allies turned isolated events into system-level stressors. A crash became an invitation, a retreat became a feint, a pause became an opening. This required a certain mindset. Titus spoke in a distributed network that responded faster than centralized command structures ever could. Decisions were made in seconds, based on partial information and shared understanding. Rather than formal orders, the Germans, constrained by hierarchy, then diminishing flexibility, struggled to match that tempo. Their systems assumed discrete phases: attack, defense, recovery. Each phase orderly. The Americans collapsed those phases together. Recovery became vulnerability. Defense lagged behind reality. Control existed only on paper. The airfield that went silent was not unique. It was one example among many, but its story illustrated how the air war was being won, not through overwhelming force alone, but through timing. Through the ability to recognize when a moment was not finished simply because it appeared so. For the pilot, these consequences unfolded far beyond his reach. He would spend the remainder of the war in captivity. Removed from the sky entirely, he would not witness the decline of the unit whose field had been destroyed. He would not see the maps marked with reduced sortie rates or the reports noting diminished readiness. He would know only that something had happened in those seconds after his capture, something that mattered in the broader view. His experience represented a truth that defined the final year of the air war, that victory no longer depended on individual brilliance or singular acts of courage. It depended on understanding systems, on recognizing how small events interacted with larger structures. The war was being decided not only by who could fly, but by who could still function, and for the Luftwaffe, silence was becoming more common. But the silence of systems that could no longer respond. War is often remembered through moments that feel decisive. A battle won, a city captured, a surrender signed. But most wars are not decided that way. They are decided through accumulation, through pressure applied unevenly but relentlessly, until one side finds that it can no longer respond in time. By the final year of the war in Europe, this was especially true in the air. The 41 seconds between capture and silence did not change the outcome of the war by themselves. No campaign pivoted on that single airfield. No front collapsed because of that one attack. What they revealed was something quieter and more dangerous. They revealed how the balance had shifted. For the Germans, the capture of a pilot was supposed to close a chapter. It was a clean outcome, a threat removed, a moment of regained control in a war increasingly defined by loss. For the Americans, the same moment represented something else entirely. It was not closure, it was information. A signal that the system was still exposed, still responsive to pressure, still vulnerable to speed. The difference lay not in equipment or numbers, but in perception. One side saw an ending, the other saw a beginning. This difference defined the late air war. American fighter units no longer measured success by individual victories, by whether the enemy could launch tomorrow what they launched today, by whether airfields functioned as intended or merely existed on maps. German air units, increasingly reactive, struggled to adapt to this tempo. Their structures assumed time to regroup, time to restore order. They were losing time faster than they could replace it. The pilot, who found himself captured on that frozen airfield, did not alter this reality alone. He did not plan the second attack. He did not coordinate the response. He did not command aircraft or issue orders. What he did was recognize the situation correctly. He understood that his capture was not the most important event unfolding, that the presence of a circling aircraft mattered more than the soldiers around him, that the moment the Germans believed they had regained control was precisely when control was weakest. His laughter was not defiance. It was comprehension. In war, understanding arrives unevenly. Some see it early. The Germans on that airfield realized the truth of the situation only when engines were already overhead and defenses were misaligned. By then, the calculation had already been made. The airfield fell silent not because the fighting had ended, but because its role in the war had ended. It would not launch aircraft, it would not intercept bombers. It would not contribute to a defense that was already stretched thin. Silence in this context was not peace. It was subtraction. For the pilot, captivity followed, months behind wire, cold, hunger, uncertainty. His war ended not in triumph, but in endurance. He survived not because of the events on that field, but because the war itself was drawing to a close. For the air war, events like this continued to accumulate. Fields went quiet. Units consolidated. Sortie race declined. The Luftwaffe did not collapse in a single moment. It faded, ground down by pressure applied faster than it could respond. This is how wars are often won, not by dramatic victories that dominate headlines, but by moments where one side understands the situation more clearly than the other, and acts before that understanding can be shared. The 41 seconds mattered not because of what happened in them, but because of what they revealed. That in modern war, the most dangerous assumption is believing that a moment has passed simply because it looks complete. Sometimes the silence that follows is not the end. It is the proof that the system has already failed. Stories like this didn't win the war alone, but together they explain how it was lost. If you want more true World War II stories told this way, subscribe.